Greetings and welcome to episode 61 of CultureWatch Radio. I'm Mark Rabich and with me is Bill Muhlenberg. G'day to you, Bill.
G'day, great to be with you.
All right, well, we're just a couple of days or so after the election results, the federal election result in Australia, 2022 in May, and it looks like we've got a change of government. What have you got to say about that?
Well, we certainly do. That much is clear. It could still just be in the lower house a minority government of Labour. They probably will sneak up to the 76 seats needed. At this point, they're a few seats shy, but of course the deals will be done with the few Greens in the lower house, the bunch of independents, most of them the Teal independents, a bunch of them got in. So one way or another, minority or majority government, they will call the shots. The Senate, had probably as many as now 12 Greens in there. So they'll be doing those deals in the Senate as well. So all up, A, they're in, and B, it looks like they could have a better run in terms of getting their agenda through. Sure, the Teals will probably eventually want to push their own items, and the Greens, they are happy with the left agenda of Labour, but just want to take it to the nth extreme. They will eventually be fighting Labour to go further. They'll say, you guys aren't left enough, you're not extreme enough, you have to go further with us, or we will not support you in what you want to get done in Parliament. So we've got at least 3 years of Labour government. I guess worse yet was the shellacking of the Libs. Not one national lost his seat. In fact, might have gained one in the Senate. But we may have all up some 19 Libs who've lost their seat. Now, the silver lining on this is probably the great majority happen to be the so-called moderates or lefties in the party. So in a sense, it's good news. There's been a house cleaning. It's been done for us. We got rid of the Tim Wilsons and the Zimmermans and the Sharmas and, hopefully left with a more conservative rump. Peter Dutton likely to become the leader, solid conservative. So even though it's been bad news in many ways, and we can talk about why this happened and how it reflects the way the Libs have been going in the States, I suppose there's hope that, if it's got rid of some of the dead wood, some of the left wood, and will bring us back to a more conservative party, as it's meant to be, without leaders trying to out-left the left, all up, it could be a good thing.
It's interesting with this election result that, as far as I'm aware, it appears that Labor actually got less of the vote than they did in terms of people than they did in 2019. And really it's more about the Liberals losing favour. And we mustn't forget, really, that Labor have actually lost favour. It's really a case of, the people of Australia just hate the Liberals a little bit more than Labor at this point in time, but neither of them are particularly loved by people. So what's the score here? I mean, you have Scott Morrison appears to have been, and as you just mentioned, a whole bunch of other Liberals appear to have just sort of embraced a very leftist view of things. It's not necessarily that they have embraced the policies, but they've embraced the language and the assumptions of the left and allowed themselves to be led by the nose, really, and been quite weak. What would you say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no question. Morrison and many, Frydenberg even, they tried to out-left the left. Their net zero policy, energy and climate policies that tried to rival anything the Greens and Labour were up to. I mean, that didn't help. They won 3 years ago by being different from Labour on issues of energy and climate. This year they lost by trying to be identical with Labour and the Greens. So, yeah, as you said before, the electorate itself is getting tired of the two-party system. Yes, a mere 32% of the primary vote went to Labour, one of the lowest ever for the Labour Party. The Libs got around 35, almost 36%. But gone are the days, right, when you could get, not just your 50%, you could get 60% or more. The two-party system not all that long ago would account for 85-90% of the vote. Today, we're getting, not even two-thirds of the vote for the two main parties. So the citizens are getting tired of the two main parties, looking at other options. That's why, in part, we had, Greens getting up a bit more. The Teal independents, thankfully, we've had a few genuine independents, obviously, and this was the good news of the whole night, I would say. Christina Keneally losing her seat as a parachute candidate for Labour by a genuine independent who wasn't funded by Simon Holmes a Court, who did her own funding, had her own grassroots support, and she knocked out Christina Keneally. So, there's a real move away, not just through to the independents, but the various small parties have all, they've gone up a bit, whether Pauline's party, United Australia Party, and so on. Sure, not translated into many seats, but still a widespread disaffection with the two-party system and a move away from them.
All right, so let's talk about the churches and Christians and what their response to this, not just really this election result is, but an overall response to the political spectrum and the issues of the day. It seems that there are a lot more churches and especially leaders who are buying into language, as I just mentioned earlier, that Scott Morrison was buying into, and a lot of the other so-called conservatives, the language of the left. And what's the problem with this?
Well, it's the same problem with Morrison and the Libs. When you push the woke agenda, you lose. First of all, you don't get elected. Secondly, you just compound the problem. I mean, we've got enough problems with the woke left of the Labour and the Greens. We don't need the churches now to join ranks with them. But sadly, that would be part of it. We could ask how many Christians this past election actually voted for Labour and the Greens, even though they're increasingly becoming such a stronghold of secular leftism, such a stronghold of anti-Christian bigotry, opposed to pretty much everything that a Christian should hold near and dear, certainly the life issues, marriage and family and so on. Why would any Christian want to vote for parties that stand against the very core values that biblical Christians should have? But that's something we've seen, sadly. It'd be good to know exactly how many ended up voting that way, but we've seen various high-profile pastors, for example, even some here in Melbourne, pushing the Labour agenda, pushing the radical left agenda, and in fact attacking conservative, pro-life Christian politicians. We had a great example here in Melbourne, right? Perhaps by the time this goes to air, we may learn if Bernie Finn, the Lib from Victoria, who's a great pro-lifer, has been kicked out of the Liberal Party here in Victoria, all because he's stood up strong for the unborn. So you've had, as I said, not just the state Liberal parties going woke and therefore growing broke. We've seen it now federally. And too many churches are aligning themselves with all this. And as I said in one of my pieces recently, pastors attacking Bernie Finn for standing up for the unborn. So when the churches start soaking in the values of the world instead of challenging the values of the world, that never bodes well for Christianity. It never bodes well for a witness. In fact, we end up just being, just like the world with no difference to it.
Well, it's like these leaders haven't realised that when God said, do not murder, it somehow didn't come with a qualification to it. It just seems amazing to me. And also, this particular leader that you're highlighted, we won't name him here, but apparently has accused some people of lying about the agenda that the WHO appears to be wanting to engage in terms of signing countries on to a way of approaching, quote, pandemics, unquote. And the thing that's amazing about this is that the information is actually readily available from the sources themselves, and yet it's been disparaged as being a conspiracy theory. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, look, there's a lot of these so-called Christian leaders who've, as I said, just bought the whole left-wing agenda item. So anything that anybody dares to differ with them about, oh, well, it's just another conspiracy theory. It's just a bunch of right-wing rednecks pushing, scare tactics and so on. It's the same thing you hear all the time from the secular left, only some of our church leaders, including so-called evangelicals, are adopting the same thing. Demonize the opponents, make them look like nut jobs and conspiracy theorists, when all we're often doing is simply, as you say, quoting the very sources that we're talking about, whether in this case with the pandemic treaty that WHO is pushing, along with people like Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab. All you got to do is quote them, and I've written a bunch of articles quoting just from them what they want to do, what they have in mind, the Great Reset and all that goes with it. This is not being made up. This is real stuff. You can go to their websites and you can read about it. But so many of these woke pastors and church leaders are just doing, again, the same thing their secular friends in the left are doing, demonizing others, refusing to actually deal with the evidence. And again, the more woke you go, the more you get into trouble. In political terms, you lose elections. And in terms of the gospel, well, you damage the credibility of the church. Why would anybody want to join a church which is trying to become as much like the world as it can be? It's only when the church is different from the world that people are attracted to it, just like it's only when the Liberal Party is actually different than Labour and the Greens that people tend to vote for it.
Yeah, I do find that quite interesting that people would even accuse others of not telling the truth when, as you say, the sources themselves actually promote things. But I mean, I heard 2 years ago on the ABC. Now, I don't listen to the ABC at all normally. I just happen to find myself driving a car of a friend of mine for about 5 minutes, and he happened to have the radio tuned to the ABC, and up they came and they were talking about the Great Reset. They used that very term. Yeah. And this was 2020, and yet it wasn't even a year later. And the very same organisation, the ABC, was disparaging people for using that term as if they're making it up. And I'm thinking it was on one of your own shows. I find that interesting. But I suppose the flip side for me is also, like, it's really important, I think, what would you say about, well, Christians need to be balanced when they approach all these subjects. Now, we've just heard about the ones who are, I suppose, on one end of the spectrum who just accept everything the left say, and then there's the other side where everything, is a conspiracy, and you're almost delving into flat earth or chemtrails kind of areas. I happen to work for the AEC during the election, just helping out in a polling booth in a little country town, and they follow all the same procedures that they do in the biggest voting booth in the country, and I couldn't see how it was even vaguely possible to rig an election in Australia. We need to be thankful that we've actually got paper voting and not the kind of thing which happened in America, where there are questions that can be asked about electronic voting, that can be asked about dumping huge amounts of votes into places at 1 o'clock in the morning with surveillance video. What would you say about the other side of it, where there's Christians who are looking for everything as if there's some great agenda going on everywhere in the shadows?
Yep. Well, again, we need some caution here. There's extremes to be avoided, as you said. Obviously, the woke, trendy left church leaders who just adopt everything that the ABC or the Guardian pushes and uses their editorial pages as their Sunday morning sermon fodder. That doesn't help any, and it's harmful as all get out. But we can sometimes go in the other extreme, of course. About 4 or 5 months ago now, when Ukraine first broke out, I wrote some pieces saying, look, a lot of people have woken up, including a lot of Christians, after 2 years of hype, hysteria, and panic porn over COVID and embracing Big Brother lockdowns and all the rest. A lot of people have woken up, including a lot of Christians. You can't always trust the media. Big tech is always a problem. You got to be careful here. Politicians can be less than helpful. Guess what? A guy with the white lab coat on, scientists, doctors, they may not always be fully to be depended on. So that was a good thing, learning to be a bit more critical, a bit more skeptical. But sadly, some maybe took it too far. So there were some almost wondering, the whole Ukraine thing, it's fake, Russia never attacked anybody. There's no bombs going off. So that's a kind of foolish extreme you can go. Sure, there's a place for healthy skepticism. Do your own research, do your own homework. But when you start to doubt everything, well, that's just as dangerous as pushing the radical left agenda.
All right, well, let's move to probably winding up. Just shift to an article that you wrote on the day of the election called God, Government and Elections, and you went through quite a few passages from 2 Chronicles that refer to various kings during ancient Israel and in Judah, of course, that were doing... I guess you'd sort of have one king that would do the right thing, especially in Judah, and then the next wouldn't, and so on. And God was still at work through the course of all of this. And you can extend it to that God was not just working through these kings of Israel and Judah, but also in other nations as well. What would you say about this subject and referencing back to what's just happened here in Australia?
Yeah, well, I wrote that piece on the morning of our federal election, so I was kind of looking ahead to whatever the outcome would be. The fact that God is concerned about politics. He does, as Scripture tells us, raise up rulers, take them down. And by the way, we may have mentioned this before as a digression, but if you watch the fireside chats with Dennis Prager in America, he has his dog Otto in the background. I don't know if he's ever been snoring when Dennis has tried to speak, but as I'm speaking now, you might even pick up my dog seems to be snoring away. So your listeners will have to forgive us for my dog. I'm not sure what she's doing here. Maybe she doesn't want me speaking. Anyway, yes, I did pen this piece looking at, all of the Old Testament is handy here, but I just went through 2 Chronicles and took some of the circumstances, some of the stories that are mentioned, how one king after another is set up or deposed. Could be a pagan king, could be a king of the 2 tribes of Israel. And just so often you read about, God put it into heart of somebody to maybe get rid of another king, or God put it into the heart of somebody to cause trouble for a king. And it was just interesting how over and over again you had the 2 truths, right? On the one hand, yes, humans are responsible for the choices they make. If they kill a king or work to overthrow him, they're responsible for that action. But you just see over and over again in these passages how it was God who seemed to be in the background, having his way. His purposes were standing. His results were being achieved. He could use even, say, evil decisions of rulers for his own purposes. So I ended up summarizing that piece by saying whatever happens tonight will be the same thing. The election results, it'll be the choices of Australian voters, and yet God is presumably somewhere in the mix. He'll get his way. He'll still be sovereign. He'll still be on the throne, whether or not we're fully happy with the election outcome.
All right, Bill, well, thank you very much for today's show, and thank you for all that wisdom about looking at elections. And There's more at the Culture Watch website. Join us again next time with another episode of Culture Watch Radio.